EA's challenge was to enable businesses to adopt digital technologies to stay competitive. So EA shifted from this long-term strategic roadmap driven profession to a more agile, more iterative kind of approach that would support this rapid change and innovation. So the evolution of enterprise architecture from this IT support role to being a business strategy enabler reflects that broader and fundamental transformation in how organizations think about themselves and their operations. People tend to believe that they should pick either one framework and then stick with it and follow it actually to the letter. But that's not the general idea of using frameworks at all.
What should a new architect understand about how these frameworks and modeling languages complement each other in practice?
That enterprise architecture frameworks and modeling languages are not competing tools, but rather complementary components of this cohesive practice.
It's not about picking just one framework or one method. It's about building a toolkit and knowing when and how to use the right tool.
The most important thing is not sticking to the rigorous description of frameworks, but it's adjusting it to your situation, to your needs, to your goals. That's very important. And if that means doing half of what is described, but doing half will lead to the desired outcome, then that's perfectly fine. Then you should stick with that.
Hello and welcome back everyone to the second episode of the EA Explained video series. And of course, I'm once again joined by our expert and guide for this journey, Eric Jager. Welcome back, Eric. It's always a pleasure having you.
Thank you, Omar. It's been a pleasure last time, and I'm sure it will be a pleasure this time as well.
Thank you so much. So let's do a quick recap of what we discussed in our last episode and provide some context on what we are going to discuss in today's one. In the last episode, we introduced the video series structure and laid the foundation for why enterprise architecture matters today and why we decided to have this video series in place. Now it's time to go deeper. Today we kick off module 1, where we explore the roots of enterprise architecture, how it started, the frameworks that shaped it, and how it evolved over the years. Eric, it's great to have you again with us for episode 2. Are you ready to dive into the origins of EA?
Absolutely. Let's do so.
Let's set the stage by going back to where it all began. Enterprise architecture didn't start out as this broad, I would say, business enabling function that we see today. It actually came from a very different place, and we will discuss this in the next couple of minutes. And understanding that will give us a perspective on where we are heading in the future, especially with all the disruption around us nowadays. So, Eric, to start today's conversation, I would like to begin with something that brings us back to the enterprise architecture roots. How was EA conceived initially, and what was its primary purpose?
Yeah, well, that's actually two great questions, Omar. And I think there is no short answer to this, because there are many actual theories about the origins and the emergence of enterprise architecture. And I don't think anyone actually knows for sure, because there was never a clear moment when someone announced the development or creation of the profession of enterprise architecture. But what we do know is that in the past, many people sought ways to structure business operations more effectively and achieve greater consistency in their implementation wherever possible. And at some point, someone called John Zachman did the same for information systems that he was working with. So in the late 1980s, he worked at IBM as a business or information systems planner, something that we would call architect or enterprise architects today. And because he came into contact with many of these information systems, he started looking for a way to kind of like interpret their coherence and to map it out. And that is what ultimately led to the creation of the Zachman framework, which is actually still being used today. Now, this framework is mainly a matrix table with 6 rows and 6 columns, in which the rows focus on describing the organization from a number of perspectives of the stakeholders, like the what, the how, the where, who, when, and why. And the columns of the framework consist of a set of artifacts which are descriptions of the organization from specific viewpoints of these stakeholders. And they are generally grouped in groups like planners, owners, designers, etc. And these viewpoints can then sometimes be presented as business concepts or system logic and so forth. So several frameworks appeared on the horizon in the years that followed. And it would be kind of excessive to mention all of them here and during this recording that we're doing. So I will highlight 1 or 2. The first version was released, I think it was 1991, and it was developed by the United States Department of Defense. And then a few years later, the Open Group built their, what we now know as the TOGAF standard, on that TAFEM framework. And then TOGAF 1 saw the light of day in 1995. And then we skip to the right of the timeline, and that's on the screen. And we can see that the 10th edition of the TOGAF standard was published in 2022. And more recently, actually in May of this year, a technical corrigendum was released to update the TOGAF standard, to give it kind of a refresh. Now, you asked me about the primary purpose of enterprise architecture. And I think in short, the primary purpose of this profession is to align an organization's IT infrastructure, its systems, its processes with its business goals and strategy. And I think enterprise architecture exists to ensure that the organization's technology and processes support its business strategy in a coherent, efficient, and sometimes even agile way.
Thank you so much, Eric. That's a powerful reminder of how, I would say, technical origins can still influence the perceptions today. And clearly, EA didn't stay in the, I would say, IT corner or the server room, like some people always say. But this brings us to unpack this evolution. So, Eric, what were the key forces or factors or challenges that drove the shift from EA being an IT support function to becoming a business strategy enabler?
Yeah, I think that the shift from enterprise architecture, from this traditional support function to this business strategy enabler, was actually driven by several things. And to name a few, you could think, for example, about digital transformation or increasing business agility requirements or closer business and IT integration. For example, digital transformation, EA's challenge was to enable businesses to adopt digital technologies to stay competitive. So EA had to actually guide organizations' digital strategies to ensure that technology investments were aligned with business innovation and with customer demands. Now, as for the increasing agility demands, organizations looked at enterprise architecture to provide an answer of how these organizations could react to the fast changing markets. And this actually required quicker responses and adaptability from enterprise architecture. So EA shifted from this long-term strategic roadmap driven profession to a more agile, more iterative kind of approach that would support this rapid change and innovation. And with regard to this business and IT integration, I think enterprise architecture needed to bridge the gap between the two, becoming kind of like a translator of sorts between business strategy and the technical execution. And the reason for this is that the line between business and IT actually blurred, and technology became central to value delivery. So organizations demanded much more from technology, not just efficiency, but innovation, agility, and even that competitive advantage. So as a result, EA had to shift from this behind the scenes IT planning function to being a core part of business strategy and transformation.
Well, that's a very interesting point, Eric, because this wasn't just a change in role, I would say. It was more a reflection of a broader mindset change or mindset shift across the whole organizations. My question to you, Eric, is how does this evolution in the mindset reflect the broader transformation that we talked about of enterprise thinking?
Yeah, well, like I said, these organizations were steadily actually coming to the realization that they needed technology to drive their business forward, to move onward. And that meant that integrating the two, meaning business and IT, was becoming actually a necessity. So the evolution of enterprise architecture from this IT support role to being a business strategy enabler reflects that broader and fundamental transformation in how organizations think about themselves and their operations. Now, traditionally, organizations were mostly structured in siloed ways with distinct boundaries between business functions on the one hand, IT departments on the other. And technology was often seen as a tool to support back office operations. It's important, but it's still secondary to the core business decisions. However, as these digital technologies began to reshape customer expectations, business models, competitive dynamics, these organizations realized that technology could no longer be treated as this isolated utility. So instead, it became central to how value is created, to how it is delivered, and even how it is sustained. And I think this shift in mindset marked the transformation from this linear, efficiency-driven organizational thinking to a more integrated, more agile, and even more value-focused approach. So organizations really began to understand that their ability to compete in fast-changing markets depended not just on operational excellence, but on the adaptability and innovation and real-time decision-making. And I think it is in this context that enterprise architecture's role expanded significantly. It moved from mapping this technical infrastructure to articulating how technology, processes, data, and even people interact to achieve the strategic goals an organization has. And this repositioning of enterprise architecture actually mirrors the organization-wide shift towards systems thinking, where the focus is on understanding the organization as this dynamic and interconnected whole, rather than a collection of separate departments. Now, furthermore, the elevation of enterprise architecture reflects a new emphasis on strategic alignment and organization-wide coherence. And there is that word again, coherence, which is really important in the context of enterprise architecture. Because as businesses faced increasing complexity, from globalization to regulatory pressures, even emerging technologies, there was this growing need for a unifying framework to ensure that these strategic initiatives, technology investments, and these operational capabilities were all pulling in the same direction. And enterprise architecture actually became that framework, helping the leadership of an organization to visualize the dependencies, to manage risk, to plan transformation in this coherent, business-driven manner. So ultimately, I think this evolution signifies that organizations are no longer thinking in terms of discrete functional excellence, but are actually striving for strategic agility and continuous innovation, with EA serving as this critical enabler of that particular shift.
100%. I would say that ties EA journey to the bigger picture, and a business-driven architecture, or a business-aligned, I would say, or strategic aligned architecture is a game changer. And this will bring us the bigger picture and how the business are becoming integrated, responsive, and strategically aligned somehow. Now that we have covered how EA has evolved over the time, let's zoom in a little bit on some of the key milestones that shaped that evolution. There are a few names that comes up all the time: Zachman, TOGAF, BIZBOK, ArchiMate, and others. From your perspective, Eric, can you briefly describe each of these frameworks, and maybe others if you would like, what they introduced to the field and how they improved the evolution of EA across the time?
Yes, I think I can. I have the slide with me, which is an image of the Zachman framework. So like I mentioned before, The Zachman framework, developed by Mr. John Zachman in the 1980s, actually kind of a taxonomy for organizing architectural artifacts like models and documents and diagrams, using this matrix that is displayed here on the screen with 6 rows with the perspectives and 6 columns containing the what, how, where, who, when, and why. And I think the contribution that this particular framework made was that it introduced the concept that enterprise architecture should be structured and comprehensive and addressing multiple stakeholder perspectives and dimensions, if you will. Zachman did not prescribe this process, so its value is in the classification and clarity of the scope. And then there is the TOGAF standard, which is actually a comprehensive framework and even a methodology for developing, managing, governing even enterprise architecture. And at its core is the architecture development method, which is an iterative approach for enterprise architecture design and implementation. And this is actually the very thing that was missing from the Zachman framework. Now, the TOGAF standard introduced a standardized method, the ADM, which we can see on the slide here, to guide the development of enterprise architecture, along with supporting tools and deliverables. So it helped formalize the EA practice and promoted actually the alignment between IT and business strategy. And then there is BIZBOK, which stands for the Business Architecture Body of Knowledge. And this guide was actually developed by the Business Architecture Guild. Now, BIZBOK is a more practical guide for specifically business architecture, focusing on how organizations are structured, how they create value, and how they operate. So BIZBOK brought this business-centric thinking into the enterprise architecture space by formalizing business architecture as a very distinct discipline. It elaborated on key concepts like the capability maps, the value streams, stakeholder mapping, and emphasizing the connection, and that is very important, between strategy and execution. And then last but not least, ArchiMate. It's the final one you asked me about. Well, ArchiMate is actually an open modeling language for enterprise architecture. It's not really a framework. More of a modeling standard further developed by the Open Group, and it allows architects to visually model architecture across multiple domains and layers. And by that, I mean the strategy and implementation layer, or even the business application and technology domains that we all know are related to the architecture profession. And I think ArchiMate's contribution was that it provided this standardized notation and visual language for enterprise architecture, which enabled consistent, and there is the word again, coherent modeling across layers of the organization. So it bridges the gap between EA models and their implementation, supporting better communication and analysis. So if you were to summarize these contributions of the frameworks and these standards, you could say that Zachman brought structure, classification. TOGAF actually brought a methodology for architecture development. BIZBOK then emphasized this business-first architecture and value delivery. And ArchiMate enabled visual modeling and communication of enterprise architecture. And by doing so, each of these frameworks and standards has contributed in a unique way to the maturity and practical utility of enterprise architecture as a discipline.
That's awesome. It's a great overview, Eric. Now, I know many can feel somehow overwhelmed right now with a lot of concepts, a lot of frameworks. Like they need to choose one framework through them, or do they need to do some mix between them? What should a new architect understand about how these frameworks and modeling languages complement each other in practice, and how they complement each other in whether they mix or they choose some parts of it?
Yeah, I think that as an aspiring architect, new architect or starting architect in your career, I think you should understand that enterprise architecture frameworks and modeling languages are not competing tools, but rather complementary components of this cohesive practice. So each serves a distinct purpose with a broader discipline of enterprise architecture. And when they are used together, they provide a more complete and effective approach to designing analyzing, and even evolving complex organizations. So for instance, the Zachman framework, and I've mentioned it a few times, offers a structured way to think about the different perspectives and elements that need to be addressed in an architecture. It doesn't prescribe how to build an architecture, but it serves as a classification scheme, kind of like a grid that helps ensure that all the necessary views, from strategic to operational, are actually considered. So this makes it an excellent foundation for organizing architectural artifacts and understanding these very important stakeholder concerns. Now then, the TOGAF standard, on the other hand, is more action-oriented, if you will. So it provides the what through its architecture development method, guiding these new and inspiring architects through the whole life cycle of creating and managing architectures. It offers governance, tools, best practices to help align architecture efforts with these business goals. So while Zachman helps organize what to think about, the TOGAF provides an approach for actually doing the work. And then there is BIZBOK, which brings depth to the business side of architecture. Now, while TOGAF includes business architecture as a phase in the ADM, BIZBOK goes much further, offering detailed techniques and practices for mapping business capabilities and value streams and organization structures. So for an aspiring architect, using BIZBOK in conjunction with TOGAF can actually enrich the whole business architecture phase and help ensure that architecture is grounded in a deep understanding of business needs and value delivery. And then there is ArchiMate, and that ties all of this together by providing a visual modeling language, which supports elements and processes described in all these frameworks. So it enables a clear and consistent representation of business, application, technology layers, even the strategy and implementation layer that I was talking about earlier, making it easier to communicate these complex architectures to different audiences, to different stakeholder groups. And ArchiMate is especially powerful when used in tandem with TOGAF, for example, as it aligns fairly well with TOGAF structure and its phases. So in practice, these frameworks and tools, they form this toolkit for aspiring architects, and they should learn to select and adapt them based on the organization's need, culture, and maturity. So the goal is not strict adherence to only one method, but actually a thoughtful integration using Zachman for scope, TOGAF for execution, BIZBOK for a particular business focus, ArchiMate for its communication, and together, and that is very important, they help create an enterprise architecture that is strategic, actionable, and aligned with the evolving realities of the business.
Yeah, that's very interesting, because if I can recap this point, it's not about picking just one framework or one method. It's about building a toolkit and knowing when and how to use the right tool and combine those tools and methods instead of staying siloed or having only one framework in place. I would say that perspective alone can save some months of trial and error to try a specific framework. What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, I think it's absolutely something that is overlooked, and in this particular time that we live in, people tend to believe that they should pick either one framework and then stick with it and follow it actually to the letter. But that's not the general idea of using frameworks at all. They need to be tailored or adjusted to the particular organizational situation that you're dealing with. And you could even use very small and specific parts and perhaps even skip most of it if those parts that you do tend to keep are actually helping you improve your organization or create this architecture that will create value for your organization. That's the general idea of using architecture frameworks, not having something set in stone that you need to follow to the letter. And I think if you are able to combine the most valuable aspects of multiple frameworks and use that as your toolkit to create architecture for your organization, I think that is a very solid basis to start your career as an aspiring architect.
That clears up a lot, especially for people who are told that they must use one framework over other or only stick to one specific framework or method to to do enterprise architecture, if we can say that. So, with that in mind, Eric, how should an architect decide when and how to apply each framework? We discussed a lot about mixing and matching all the frameworks and methods together and building a toolkit. But do they have or a specific framework, methodology, or I would say steps that they can follow to decide how and when they should apply each framework?
It's a very good question, and I think there are many answers to that particular question. So I don't think I should be dictating people how to approach using architecture frameworks, but I can provide a little bit of insight on something that could help decide which, when and how to apply its framework. So I think looking back then at what was discussed earlier, I think then structurally, if you look at the Zachman framework, which is more static and descriptive as compared to TOGAF, being more dynamic, procedural, if you will, then Zachman can help identify these architectural viewpoints and artifacts, but it does not necessarily specify how they should be created or used. And that's where TOGAF then steps in, as it tries to offer an approach to determine or to fill in the missing how, but it does not emphasize classification or completeness in the same rigorous matrix form that Zachman does. So in practice, many organizations will actually use Zachman for structure, TOGAF for execution, and then again, complementing each other effectively when they are applied together. So ultimately, TOGAF is about doing enterprise architecture, while Zachman is about understanding and organizing it. So I think an architect can draw from both, using Zachman to ensure comprehensive coverage of the organization, and then the TOGAF standard to guide the development and governance of architecture solutions. So I think that's something that might be helpful to an architect when they are deciding when and how to apply each framework.
That's a very good and powerful perspective. And if we can recap this, I would say that it is not a rigid choice for practitioners. It's always about the organization needs, the business goals, where you are from the EA journey. Are you setting up the practice, or you are in the middle of the practice? You are to, I would say, evolve or maintain the current practice or not? What are the maturity level that the organization is within? So I think all of these aspects will affect the decision-making process in defining how and when to use which framework.
Yeah, exactly. It's all about creating and doing these things that will create value for either your architecture project or in the end for your organization. That's most important. The most important thing is not sticking to the rigorous description of frameworks, but it's adjusting it to your situation, to your needs, to your goals. That's very important. And if that means doing half of what is described, but doing half will lead to the desired outcome, then that's perfectly fine. Then you should stick with that. So tailoring these frameworks, using them in conjunction with each other, in tandem with each other, I think that's an absolute great idea. And new or aspiring architects should take that to heart.